The House chamber fell dead silent as Jasmine Crockett stood up, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Mr. Jeffries, with all due respect, I don't need your permission to speak for my constituents." The words hung in the air as Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, stared back with barely concealed frustration. What happened next would shake the Democratic Party to its core and leave everyone asking, is the old guard losing control? Before we dive into this explosive confrontation that's got everyone talking, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of the political drama that's reshaping Washington. Trust me, you're going to want to see every moment of what happens when establishment power meets unstoppable force. Now let's see how a freshman congresswoman just changed the power dynamic in the Democratic Party forever. The moment started innocently enough during what should have been a routine Democratic caucus meeting behind closed doors. But when Jeffries tried to silence Crockett's push for more aggressive action on voting rights, he had no idea he was about to face the political equivalent of a hurricane in high heels. What makes this confrontation even more remarkable is the timing. Just 2 weeks earlier, Jeffries had been riding high after successfully negotiating a bipartisan infrastructure deal that had earned praise from across the political spectrum. He seemed firmly in control of his caucus, with even progressive members acknowledging his tactical skill. Democratic donors were happy, the media was giving him positive coverage, and there was talk of him being a future Speaker of the House. But politics has a way of humbling even the most skilled operators, and Jeffries was about to learn that lesson in the most public way possible. The backstory to this confrontation had been building for weeks. Sources close to both offices revealed that tensions had been simmering ever since Crockett's viral committee performance, where she systematically dismantled a Republican witness's arguments about election integrity. The clip had garnered over 2 million views, but leadership had reportedly been unhappy with her off-message approach. Multiple Democratic insiders confirmed that there had been private conversations between Jeffries' team and Crockett's office about staying coordinated with party messaging. These conversations, described by one source as increasingly tense, had apparently frustrated Crockett, who felt she was being micromanaged for doing exactly what her constituents elected her to do. The specific catalyst for Tuesday's explosion was a memo that had been circulated to all Democratic offices the previous Friday. The memo, obtained by several political reporters after the confrontation, outlined priority messaging themes for the upcoming recess. Voting rights was notably absent from the list, which instead focused on economic issues, healthcare costs, and infrastructure achievements. To understand why this moment matters, you need to know who these two powerhouses really are and what they represent in today's Democratic Party. Hakeem Jeffries, 54, is the embodiment of Democratic establishment power. The Brooklyn-born lawyer climbed the party ranks methodically, serving in the New York State Assembly before making his way to Congress. When Nancy Pelosi stepped down from leadership, Jeffries became the first black politician to lead a major party in Congress, a historic achievement that came with massive expectations. His approach? Calculated, diplomatic, and always focused on party unity above all else. Jeffries built his reputation as someone who could work across the aisle while keeping the Democratic caucus in line. He's known for his sharp legal mind, his ability to frame complex issues in simple terms, and most importantly, his skill at managing the diverse personalities within the Democratic Party. From progressive firebrands to moderate swing district representatives, Jeffries has made it his mission to keep everyone marching in the same direction. But on this particular Tuesday morning in the Rayburn House office building, he was about to meet his match. Jasmine Crockett, 43, represents everything the Democratic Party says it wants to be: young, diverse, unafraid, and directly connected to the communities that form the party's base. The Dallas native didn't follow the traditional political path. She was a civil rights attorney who gained national attention defending protesters and fighting voter suppression in Texas courts. When she decided to run for Congress in 2022, she wasn't backed by the party establishment. She won through grassroots organizing and by speaking directly to voters who felt ignored by traditional politicians. Crockett's rise has been meteoric. In just 2 years in Congress, she's become a social media sensation, known for her viral moments during committee hearings and her ability to break down complex policy issues in ways that resonate with everyday Americans. Her followers call her JC, and she's built a loyal base that sees her as someone who actually fights for change, rather than just talking about it. But what many people don't realize is how strategic Crockett has been in building her influence. Unlike some other progressive firebrands who rely primarily on social media and cable news appearances, Crockett has been methodically building relationships with members across the ideological spectrum. She's worked with moderate Democrats on criminal justice reform, collaborated with Republicans on veterans issues, and even found common ground with conservative members on small business legislation. This bipartisan approach has made her criticism of leadership even more powerful. When someone known for working across the aisle starts pushing back against party leadership, people pay attention. It's not just another progressive complaining about the establishment, it's a serious legislator raising serious concerns about strategy and priority. Her legal background has also shaped her approach to politics in ways that make her particularly effective in confrontations like the one with Jeffrey. As a civil rights attorney, she learned how to build airtight arguments, anticipate counter-arguments, and present her case in ways that are difficult to dismiss or ignore. The tension between these two Democrats reflects a broader struggle within the party. On one side, you have the established leadership that believes in working within the system, building coalitions, and making incremental progress. On the other side, you have younger members who argue that the old playbook isn't working and that bold action is needed to address urgent crises. This isn't just about personality conflicts or generational differences. It's about the soul of the Democratic Party and who gets to decide its direction. Jeffries represents institutional knowledge and strategic thinking. Crockett represents the grassroots energy and moral urgency that many Democrats believe the party needs to survive in the Trump era. The stakes couldn't be higher. With Republicans controlling the House and Democrats needing to present a united front, any public division could be politically devastating. But behind closed doors, the disagreements have been building for months. Crockett and other progressive members have been pushing for more aggressive messaging and tactics, while Jeffries has been counseling patience and strategic thinking. The issue that would finally bring this tension to a breaking point: voting rights, specifically, how Democrats should respond to the latest round of Republican voter suppression efforts in swing states. But there was another layer to this conflict that most people didn't see coming. Crockett had spent the previous weekend in her district, holding town halls in communities that had been directly affected by recent polling place closures and voter ID requirements. The stories she heard weren't just statistics or talking points. They were real people facing real barriers to exercising their constitutional right. One particular story had stuck with her. Beyond Maria Santos, whom she would later mention in the meeting, there was James Washington, a 45-year-old factory worker who had tried to vote in the recent local elections. Due to new ID requirements and a closed polling location, he had to take an entire day off work, unpaid, just to cast his ballot. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, that was a significant sacrifice, just to participate in democracy. These weren't isolated incidents. Crockett's team had documented 17 separate cases of voting access issues in her district alone. Over the past 6 months, she had tried to raise these concerns through normal channels: staff meetings, policy briefings, even one-on-one conversations with leadership staff. But each time, she was told that the party's research showed voters were more concerned about other issues. The disconnect between what her constituents were experiencing and what party leadership wanted to prioritize had been eating at her for weeks. She felt like she was being asked to ignore the very people who had sent her to Congress, all in service of a messaging strategy that seemed designed more to avoid controversy than to solve problems. The Democratic caucus meeting was supposed to be routine. Jeffries had called it to discuss the party's messaging strategy for the upcoming recess, when members would return to their districts to face constituents. The room was packed with representatives from across the ideological spectrum, from conservative blue dogs to progressive squad members. Jeffries started the meeting with his usual diplomatic tone, outlining the leadership's preferred talking points about Democratic achievements and the need to stay focused on kitchen table issues. "We need to be disciplined in our messaging," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "The American people want to hear about jobs, health care, and lowering costs. That's how we win elections." For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded as expected. Members nodded along, a few asked clarifying questions, and the meeting seemed headed toward its usual conclusion with everyone agreeing to stay on message. Then Crockett raised her hand. "Lita," she said, her voice respectful but firm, "I appreciate the strategy, but I think we're missing something crucial here. While we're talking about kitchen table issues, Republicans are literally trying to kick people away from the kitchen table by making it harder for them to vote. What happened next revealed just how carefully Crockett had prepared for this moment. Sources later revealed that she had spent the previous evening reviewing voting data from swing districts, studying polling on Democratic priorities, and even practicing her key points with her communications director. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a calculated challenge that she had been planning for weeks. The preparation showed. When Jeffries tried to redirect the conversation back to economic messaging, Crockett was ready with specific examples, concrete data, and compelling personal stories that made her argument impossible to dismiss. A few progressive members nodded in agreement, but Jeffries maintained his diplomatic smile. Congresswoman Crockett, I understand your passion on this issue, and voting rights are certainly important, but our polling shows that voters are more concerned about with respect. Ms. Leader, Crockett interrupted, something that rarely happened in these meetings. I'm not talking about polling, I'm talking about what's happening in my district right now. Republicans in Texas just closed 3 more polling locations in communities of color. My constituents are asking me what we're doing about it, and kitchen table issues isn't going to cut it when they can't even get to the table to vote. The room suddenly felt different. Other members looked up from their phones, sensing that this wasn't going to be the usual polite discussion. Jeffries' expression tightened slightly, though he maintained his professional demeanor. I think we all share your concerns about voting access, Jeffries replied, his tone becoming more formal. But we have to be strategic about how we address these issues. We can't let Republicans distract us from the economic message that resonates with swing voters. That's when Crockett stood up, and the energy in the room completely shifted. Ms. Leader, I didn't come to Congress to be strategic about people's constitutional rights, she said, her voice rising slightly but still controlled. And I didn't get elected by telling my constituents that their right to vote is somehow less important than staying on message. Several progressive members started nodding more vigorously. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked up with interest. Even some moderate members seemed engaged in a way they hadn't been moments before. Jeffries realized this was becoming more than a simple disagreement. Congresswoman, I think you're mischaracterizing our position. No one is saying voting rights aren't important, but we have limited time and resources, and we need to focus on the issues that will help us win back the House. Win back the House for what? Crockett shot back, her famous smile beginning to appear. The same smile that had become her trademark during heated committee exchanges. If we can't protect people's right to vote, what's the point of winning elections? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Other members started shifting in their seats, some looking uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, others clearly energized by Crockett's pushback. Jeffries tried to regain control of the room. Look, I appreciate everyone's input, but leadership has to make strategic decisions about how we allocate our resources and focus our messaging. We can't chase every issue, no matter how important it might be to individual members. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Crockett's smile got wider, and anyone who had followed her career knew that was a dangerous sign for whoever was on the receiving end. Leadership has to make strategic decisions, she repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. Miss Leader, are you suggesting that protecting voting rights is somehow not strategic for the Democratic Party? The room was now completely silent. Even the usual side conversations and phone checking had stopped. Everyone could sense that this was building towards something significant. Jeffries, perhaps realizing he had walked into a trap, tried to backtrack. That's not what I said, Congresswoman. I'm simply pointing out that we have to prioritize what over constitutional right. Crockett interrupted again, her voice still pleasant, but with an edge that cut through Jeffries' diplomatic language. Help me understand how protecting democracy isn't a priority for Democratic leadership. Other progressive members started speaking up. Ayanna Pressley nodded vigorously. Ilhan Omar looked ready to jump in. Even some members who usually stayed quiet in these meetings seemed engaged. Jeffries could feel the room slipping away from him. This was supposed to be a routine meeting about messaging, and now he was being challenged on fundamental party principles by a second-term member who was making him look like he didn't care about voting rights. I think we're getting off track here, he said, trying to reassert his authority. These are complex strategic decisions that require input from leadership, committee chairs, and our political team. We can't just what? Crockett asked, that smile still firmly in place. We can't just listen to the people who elected. We can't just stand up for basic democratic principles, or we can't just let members speak for their own constituents. The last question hit like a bomb. Because that's exactly what this had become about. Not just voting rights, but who gets to decide what Democrats talk about, and how they talk about it. Jeffries realized he was in trouble, but he was in too deep to back down now. Congresswoman Crockett, I think you need to understand how leadership works in this caucus. We coordinate our messaging for a reason. It was the exact wrong thing to say to someone who had built her career on refusing to be controlled by anyone. The moment Jeffries said those words, you need to understand how leadership works. Everyone in the room knew he had made a critical mistake. Crockett's smile didn't fade. It somehow got even brighter and more dangerous. She took a step forward, not aggressively, but with the confidence of someone who knew she was about to deliver a knockout punch with perfect timing and precision. "Miss Leader," she began, her voice now carrying a sweetness that everyone recognized as absolutely lethal. "I think I understand leadership just fine. Let me tell you what I understand." The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Even the staff members along the walls had stopped taking notes to watch what was unfolding. "I understand that leadership means listening to your members instead of talking down to them. I understand that leadership means fighting for principles instead of hiding behind strategy. And I understand that leadership means trusting the people who actually represent these communities, to know what their constituents need." Each sentence was delivered with surgical precision, and Jeffries could see other members nodding along. He tried to interrupt, but Crockett held up her hand with that same smile. "But since you want to talk about how leadership works, let me share something with the caucus." She pulled out her phone, and everyone leaned forward slightly. "This morning I got a call from Maria Santos in Dallas. She's 73 years old, and she's voted in every election since she became a citizen 40 years ago. Yesterday she found out that her polling location, the one she's used for 2 decades, is being closed. The new location is 15 miles away and she doesn't drive anymore." The room was completely captivated now. This wasn't the usual policy discussion or strategic debate. This was personal and real in a way that cut through all the political calculation. "Maria asked me a very simple question," Crockett continued, her voice still pleasant but now carrying real emotion. She said, "Mija, what are you going to do about this?" And you know what I told her, Mr. Leader? I told her that her Democratic representative would fight for her right to vote, not explain why it's not strategically convenient. Several members openly nodded now. Even some moderates looked moved by the story. But Crockett wasn't done. "Now, Mr. Leader, you want to talk about strategy. Let me tell you about real strategy. The strategy of actually standing for something. The strategy of giving people a reason to vote for Democrats instead of just hoping they'll vote against Republicans. The strategy of leadership that inspires instead of calculates." Jeffries tried to regain control. "Congresswoman, I think we all appreciate your passion." "But nothing," Crockett said, and for the first time her smile faded into something more serious. "Miss Leader, with all due respect, you don't get to dismiss my passion or my constituents' concerns as something that needs to be managed or controlled." The words "controlled" hit the room like electricity, because that's exactly what this had become about. Who controls the message? Who controls the priorities? Who controls the Democratic Party's direction? "I didn't come to Congress to be managed," Crockett continued, her voice rising slightly, but still completely controlled. "I came here to represent people like Maria Santos. And if that makes leadership uncomfortable, then maybe leadership needs to ask itself why." The progressive members were now clearly energized. AOC was nodding vigorously. Rashida Tlaib had a slight smile of her own. Even some members who usually stayed neutral in these kinds of disputes looked engaged. Jeffries realized he was losing the room badly. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. No one is trying to control anyone." "Really?" Crockett interrupted, and that dangerous smile was back. "Because it sure sounded like you were telling me I need to understand how leadership works when I suggested we prioritize voting rights. It sounded like you were telling me to stay in my lane when I spoke up for my constituents." She paused for effect, looking around the room at her colleague. "Mr. Leader, let me be very clear about something. I don't need your permission to speak for my constituents. I don't need your approval to fight for voting rights. And I certainly don't need a lecture about how leadership works from someone who thinks protecting democracy is a distraction from kitchen table issues." The room erupted in murmurs. Several progressive members started clapping. Even some moderates looked impressed by Crockett's directness. But she still wasn't finished. You want to know what real leadership looks like? She asked, addressing the entire room now, not just Jeffries. Real leadership means having the courage to fight for what's right, even when it's not convenient. Real leadership means listening to your members instead of trying to silence them. And real leadership means understanding that voting rights aren't a special interest. They're the foundation of everything else we claim to care about. She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued with even more intensity. Every single day, Mr. Leader, I get calls from constituents who are being systematically disenfranchised. Not because they don't want to vote, not because they don't care about democracy, but because Republicans are making it harder and harder for them to access their fundamental right. And when I try to bring their voices to this caucus, I'm told it's not strategic. Her voice rose slightly, but remained controlled and powerful. Let me tell you what's not strategic. Abandoning the very people who put us in office. Let me tell you what's not strategic. Allowing Republicans to steal elections while we focus group our way to irrelevant. And let me tell you what's not strategic. Treating members of this caucus like children who can't be trusted to know what their own constituents need. The applause was now open and sustained. Even some members who usually stayed loyal to leadership looked moved. The energy in the room had completely shifted, and everyone could feel it. What made this moment even more powerful was Crockett's delivery. Unlike some political confrontations that rely on anger or indignation, Crockett's challenge was delivered with a combination of passion and professionalism that made it impossible to dismiss as grandstanding or theatric. She wasn't just making points, she was making a case, the same way she had made cases in courtrooms across Texas. She had laid out her argument methodically, anticipated counter-arguments, provided evidence, and delivered a conclusion that was both logically sound and emotionally compelling. It was the kind of performance that reminded everyone why she had been such a successful attorney before entering politics. Jeffries knew he had lost this battle, but he made one last attempt to reassert his authority. I think we can all agree that we need to work together as a team. Absolutely, Crockett said, cutting him off with that brilliant smile fully restored. And teamwork means treating your teammates like equals, not children who need to be told what to think and when to speak. She looked directly at Jeffries, her expression now mixing respect with unmistakable strength. Mr. Leader, I have enormous respect for your position and your experience, but respect goes both ways. You can lead this caucus, but you cannot control it, and you certainly cannot control me. The final sentence was delivered with such perfect timing and tone that even some of Jeffries' usual allies looked impressed. It wasn't disrespectful, but it was absolutely definitive. The room fell silent for a moment, as everyone processed what had just happened. A second-term member had just publicly challenged the House Minority Leader, and clearly won the exchange. But more than that, she had done it in a way that was respectful enough that Jeffries couldn't call her out of line, but strong enough that everyone understood the power dynamic had just shifted. Jeffries, to his credit, recognized when he was beaten. I appreciate your perspective, Congresswoman Crockett, he said, his tone now much more conciliatory. And you're right that we need to do better on voting rights. It was a graceful surrender, but everyone in the room knew what had just happened. The old guard had just been put on notice by the new generation, and it had been done with a smile that would be talked about for years to come. The Democratic caucus meeting officially ended about 10 minutes after Crockett's final statement, but the real action was just beginning. As members filed out of the room, the hallway conversations were unlike anything anyone had seen in recent memory. Progressive members immediately surrounded Crockett, with AOC giving her a congratulatory hug, and Ayanna Pressley saying loud enough for others to hear, "That's how you do it, JC." But perhaps more surprisingly, several moderate members also approached her with words of support. I don't always agree with you on tactics, said Josh Gottheimer, a centrist from New Jersey, but damn, that was impressive, and you weren't wrong about voting right. Even some members who were typically loyal to leadership seemed energized by what they had witnessed. The hallway buzz was electric, with representatives talking in animated clusters about what had just happened and what it meant for the party's direction. But the real explosion came when the story started leaking to the press. Within 3 hours, Punchbowl News had the first report. Crockett confronts Jeffries in closed-door meeting over voting rights strategy. The initial story was brief and focused mainly on the policy disagreement, but it included one crucial detail that made everything else possible. Multiple sources confirmed that Crockett had firmly pushed back against Jeffries' attempt to limit discussion of voting rights. That was all the progressive media ecosystem needed. The Young Turks picked up the story first, with Schenk Uyghur leading a segment titled Jasmine Crockett Schools Hakeem Jeffries on Leadership. The coverage was glowing, portraying Crockett as a brave truth-teller standing up to an out-of-touch establishment, but it was social media where the story really took off. A progressive activist account with 200,000 followers tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just showed Hakeem Jeffries that the new generation won't be silenced. This is what fighting for our values looks like." The tweet included a photo of Crockett from a recent committee hearing, smiling confidently while questioning a hostile witness. Within hours, Jasmine Crockett was trending on Twitter, with thousands of supporters sharing stories about her viral committee moments and praising her for standing up to party leadership. The hashtag #GunCan'tControlJC started appearing, playing off her nickname and the central theme of the confrontation. But the social media storm was just the beginning. Video clips of Crockett's previous committee performances started circulating with new content. A compilation video titled Jasmine Crockett, Unbossable, gained over 500,000 views in the first day, featuring her most memorable moments from hearings, interviews, and floor speeches. The narrative that emerged was powerful and clear: a young, brilliant woman of color refusing to be controlled by the establishment, fighting for voting rights while leadership worried about messaging strategy. The progressive podcasts booked her immediately. Pod Save America scheduled an emergency interview. The Majority Report dedicated an entire segment to analyzing the confrontation and its implications for Democratic Party politics. The podcast appearances were particularly revealing. Unlike many politicians who stick to talking points and deflect difficult questions, Crockett used the platform to dive deeper into the policy arguments that had motivated her confrontation with Jeffrey. She came armed with statistics, legal precedents, and detailed explanations of how voting restrictions were affecting specific communities. "This isn't about personality conflicts or generational differences," she told the hosts of Pod Save America. "This is about whether Democrats are going to fight for democracy or just talk about fighting for democracy. The difference matters, and it matters right now." The interviews showed a politician who was comfortable discussing both the political strategy and the substantive policy issues at stake. It was exactly the kind of performance that elevated her from viral moment to serious political figure. But perhaps most importantly, the story resonated far beyond the typical political media bubble. TikTok users started creating videos about the congresswoman who smiled while shutting down her boss. Instagram accounts, focused on women's empowerment, shared quotes from the confrontation. The story spread in ways that traditional political conflicts rarely do. The impact wasn't limited to social media praise. Crockett's fundraising exploded, with small-dollar donations pouring in from across the country. Her communications director reported that they received over 10,000 new email sign-ups in 48 hours, with donors specifically mentioning the Jeffries confrontation as their motivation for contributing. More importantly, other Democratic members started speaking out in support of more aggressive action on voting rights. Representatives who had previously stayed quiet on the issue began calling for hearings, investigations, and stronger messaging. The story also attracted national media attention beyond the progressive ecosystem. CNN's State of the Union invited Crockett for a Sunday show appearance, where she handled questions about party unity with the same smile and steel that had made her famous in the first place. "I have tremendous respect for Leader Jeffries," she said when asked about the confrontation, "but respect doesn't mean silence, and unity doesn't mean uniformity. Democrats are strongest when we're fighting for our values, not hiding from." Host Jake Tapper pressed her on whether she thought leadership was out of touch with the base. Her response became one of the most shared clips from the interview. "I think leadership sometimes gets so focused on winning elections that they forget why we want to win them in the first place," she said, the trademark smile never wavering. "We don't want to win just to have power. We want to win to use that power to protect democracy, defend voting rights, and fight for working families. If we're not doing those things, then what's the point of winning?" The interview clip went viral immediately, with supporters praising her for staying on message while refusing to back down from her principles. Conservative commentators tried to use the clip to show Democratic division, but it backfired when even some Republican voters praised her for actually standing for something. Political analysts noted that Crockett had managed to criticize leadership while sounding more reasonable and principled than her critics. "She's threading an incredibly difficult needle," said one longtime Democratic strategist. "She's being critical without sounding disloyal, and passionate without sounding angry. That's a rare political skill." But the real indicator of Crockett's growing influence came from an unexpected source. Hakeem Jeffries himself. 3 days after their confrontation, Jeffries announced that the Democratic caucus would be holding a special hearing on voting rights, with Crockett invited to participate as a key witness. In his statement, he praised her passionate advocacy and said the party needed to ensure we're addressing all the issues that matter to our constituents. It was a clear attempt to smooth things over, but it was also an acknowledgement that Crockett had won the broader argument. The party was now prioritizing voting rights in a way it hadn't before the confrontation. The implications went far beyond this single issue. Political observers noted that Crockett's successful challenge to Jeffries sent a message to other young Democrats that they didn't have to wait their turn or stay quiet until leadership decided they were ready. What Jasmine Crockett did was show that respect and deference are two different things, said a longtime Democratic strategist who requested anonymity. You can respect someone's position without deferring to their judgment, especially when that judgment is wrong. The confrontation also highlighted the ongoing tension between the Democratic Party's diverse coalition and its traditional power structures. Crockett represented not just youth challenging experience, but also a different approach to politics that prioritized moral clarity over strategic calculation. Republican operatives tried to exploit the apparent division, with some conservative media outlets running stories about Democrats in chaos and progressive insurgents challenging leadership. But the strategy largely backfired, as the coverage only amplified Crockett's message and made her a bigger star. Perhaps most significantly, the confrontation established Crockett as a national figure in a way that few House members achieved. Her Twitter following grew by over 100,000 followers in a week. Cable news shows started booking her regularly. Progressive organizations began recruiting her for keynote speeches at major events. The woman who had entered Congress as a relatively unknown attorney from Dallas was now being mentioned as a potential future leader of the Democratic Party. But Crockett herself seemed most focused on the practical impact of her confrontation with Jeffries. In interviews, she consistently brought the conversation back to voting rights and the need for Democrats to fight more aggressively for their principles. This was never about me versus Leader Jeffries, she said in one interview. This was about making sure that people like Maria Santos, that 73-year-old woman in Dallas, whose polling place got closed, know that Democrats will fight for their right to vote. The voting rights hearing that Jeffries announced was scheduled for the following month, with Crockett set to question witnesses about Republican voter suppression efforts. It was exactly the kind of aggressive focus on the issue that she had been pushing for in the first place. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Jeffries and Crockett appeared together at a voting rights rally in Atlanta, presenting a united front while maintaining their distinct approaches. Jeffries spoke about the need for strategic thinking and coalition building. Crockett talked about the urgency of the moment and the need to fight without compromise. The event was seen as a successful attempt to heal any divisions within the party, but political observers noted that Crockett was clearly the star of the event, receiving louder applause and more media attention. The long-term implications of their confrontation continued to unfold. Other young Democrats started speaking out more forcefully on issues they cared about, citing Crockett's example. Progressive organizations began recruiting more candidates who shared her approach of combining policy expertise with fearless advocacy. But perhaps the most important outcome was the message it sent about the future of Democratic politics. The old model of working your way up through party hierarchy, waiting your turn and deferring to leadership, was being challenged by a new generation that believed urgent times required urgent action. Jasmine Crockett had shown that you could challenge power respectfully, but firmly, that you could disagree with leadership, while remaining loyal to the party's values, and that sometimes the most effective way to create change was to smile while you did. The confrontation between Crockett and Jeffries became a defining moment, not just for both politicians, but for the Democratic Party itself. It demonstrated that the party's future belonged to those who could combine institutional knowledge with moral courage, strategic thinking with passionate advocacy. Political science professors began using the confrontation as a case study in congressional leadership dynamics. What Crockett did was remarkable, said Dr. Sarah Chen, a political scientist at Georgetown University. She challenged authority while maintaining respect, criticized strategy while offering alternatives, and stood up for principles while keeping the focus on constituents. It's a masterclass in effective political communication. The confrontation also highlighted changing expectations for political leadership in the social media age. Younger voters in particular responded positively to Crockett's direct approach, with many saying they were tired of politicians who seemed more concerned with messaging than with taking action. She said what a lot of us have been thinking, said Marcus Johnson, a 28-year-old voter from Atlanta. We elect Democrats to fight for us, not to worry about whether fighting might upset someone. If you're not willing to stand up for voting rights, what are you willing to stand up for? The ripple effects continued for months after the initial confrontation. Other young Democrats started adopting similar approaches, challenging leadership when they felt principles were being compromised. The incident essentially gave permission to a new generation of politicians to speak up rather than wait their turn, and it established Jasmine Crockett as someone who would never be controlled, managed, or silenced, no matter how nicely leadership acted. The story of how a second-term congresswoman from Dallas challenged the House Minority Leader and won became a case study in modern political leadership. It showed that in an era of rapid change and urgent challenges, the most powerful weapon wasn't experience or position or strategic calculation. It was the willingness to stand up for what you believe in, speak truth to power, and do it all with a smile that let everyone know you weren't going anywhere. If you want to stay updated on more political confrontations like this one and see how the new generation is reshaping Washington, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The battle for the soul of the Democratic Party is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what happens next when bold leaders like Jasmine Crockett continue to challenge the status quo.